So, it has been a while, but welcome to our new edition of the Climbing Talent Development Show. And we had some really busy weeks and months even since we last met. The Olympic Games happened and the Youth World happened, and this show is a bit of a recap of these two major events, right?
Yeah, and on the way to the Adult World Championships and the final stop of Bouldering World Cup also in Seoul, which is pretty cool.
Yes. Shall we talk? Yes. I mean, who would have thought that this season becomes so busy? And I think you left to the Youth Worlds on basically. You knew that it would be happening in the very last minute, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like just taking everything was pretty last minute. It was like I had a feeling we were going, but it was just not until we were actually in Russia did I feel like, okay, here we are.
Yeah. And to compensate for that by still being on Russia time.
Yes, very jet.
Yeah. Still. But still, let's talk about, it seems such a long time ago, but let's talk briefly about the Olympic Games. About the climbing's appearance at the Olympic Games. What are your thoughts? Looking back at, I mean, it's not even a month, right, ago?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are, I think there was a lot of criticism on social media for and in everything basically from the climbing community about the format, and I think that was kind of one of my big thoughts. For me, it was just cool. It was like a spectacle, and I really, in my mind, it was an exhibition more than anything. It's like an exhibition of the sport. And I think there was a lot of criticism, and obviously those are the kind of things that I think are good in the sense that they push these federations to like try to come up with something better in the future, and I think that's going to be important. But at the same time, it was like it basically is just showcasing the sport to the world as like this is what climbing can offer. And it was not perfect for sure, but it was still cool. So that's how I felt about it. What did you think?
No, actually, exactly the same. Like a showcase, even like now that because the format was such a one-off, there's very little to learn from this, especially since everything that happened was a consequence of this format, So everything, and once they're set for this format was almost clear that there wouldn't be a very satisfying clear-cut result in terms of the athletic performances. I'm not saying that everybody deserved. There was really no problem with any of the results. They all made sense, and the people that earned them totally deserved it. But if it would have been different, no, I would say the same. So exactly. But I think, like going back to when the IFSC started to pursue this dream, there was exactly what they had in mind, to have this as a showcase, how attractive climbing competitions can be. So I think they totally reached us. And I watched quite a bit of the other new activities like surfing and skateboarding, and even BMX that has been already at the Olympics. And, they were really not as attractive. I really like these activities, but like surfing is really boring. Most of the time you're watching the ocean and tiny people paddling, being lost on the ocean, and nothing really happening.
I loved it. Well, I didn't get to watch the surfing very much, but I love watching the skating. I think that there's like the I'm curious. I haven't talked to that many people. I would be interested to see if you've talked to many people who aren't climbers at all that watched uh, the Olympics. The coverage in the U.S. was uh, it was very spotty. It was like they'd show it at certain
Yes,
times, and
yeah,
it would be
yeah.
like super cut up. So
Yes, yes, but I think that's also true for the climbing. I think that like the TV, the direction was terrible, and I was quite frankly even a little bit disappointed from a hosting nation like Japan. I was really expecting, like, for example, with skating, they were trying out this bullet time matrix like movements, and I think sometimes they even tried them in climbing too. But it was really like not up to the 21st century. It looked like a version from the 90s. And when the first, we've seen the Matrix, let's try. It's many different cameras, but they had so few cameras that it was basically like going chop, 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 chop. Oh, where I'm going with my hand, like chop, very choppy, so, and the same what we saw before, like in the Innsbruck World Cup, like the TV direction is super important, and unfortunately, many of the involved people don't know what they're doing. So we saw a lot of chalking, like a cutaway of Janja's last attempt to somebody chalking, or stuff like this. But that was true for the skateboarding and the surfing too. That is something where the Olympic Games feel really old-fashioned compared to some of the more, yeah, I shouldn't say that they're more commercial, because the Olympic Games are really like the pinnacle of being commercial. But I think some events do a much better job in covering what they're presenting.
yeah, and I think it's almost like because they think maybe they don't have full confidence in the sport selling itself, so they're trying to make it more interesting
Yes,
instead of just,
yeah,
and this has been true too, like of just like sometimes IFSC coverage is just too zoomed in or something, and we just
yeah,
probably like you just want to watch the climbing, and a lot of
yeah,
people think the climbing can sell itself. So, but
yeah,
let's bring it into the context of maybe one of the main points of this conversation that we were going to have today was about, I think, choking and clutch performances, like the two sides of a coin. In terms of, you had a really interesting post on Instagram about how it ties into research that it's not just a human, like a solely
yeah,
human phenomenon.
yeah.
But
This is a new study where they found out that monkeys choke too. If the reward is really high, they no, okay. The first question, of course, is, and this is something we should really talk about, because I really think that's important for young athletes, or actually for any athletes and coaches and parents to consider. What do we actually talk about when we call it choking? And in my book, that is, well, everything that is not performing at your best. So I have a very liberal definition of choking, which is a problem, of course, because choking itself sounds terrible. It sounds like a traumatic situation. So this is definitely something we should talk about. But anyhow, with this, the study you see here is that they had a target reach trial for monkeys. And if there was a huge reward, they called it the jackpot, then the monkeys didn't perform at their best. And I think that somehow when I read this was almost a little bit of, it's almost a little relief, because very often we think of cognitive function that is suffering. We were expecting too much, and we tell our athletes to don't have expectations and stuff like this. But then I don't think that the monkeys are really concerned about expectations so much. So I found this, as I said, almost a little relief. That this is such a common thing to do. If the reward is really, really high, we have a problem with that. And the paradox is that our performance tends to increase the higher the reward is, up to this tipping point.
Yeah, and to contextualize it a little bit with like the opposite, like you said, choking sounds terrible, but it's always like every time I'm trying to think of how to explain what happened, it's just also like the best way to describe it.
Yes.
It's also the perfect word, uh, because it pretty much immediately, as soon as you say that, like people understand exactly what you're saying. Uh, but it does sound pretty rough, you know, and it is a rough experience as an athlete. But the alternative is clutch performance, and I don't think there's much more of a clutch performance that you can highlight than Yanya being expected to win by every single person and then doing it.
Although, I mean, I think per definition, a clutch performance is something that goes on top of what you're usually capable of. And the question is, I mean, I think in lead, going back to the Olympics, Janja really had to dig deep. And this was the thing about the Olympics, that it was a lot about the priorities everybody had in preparing for the Olympic Games. And I would almost argue that maybe she was not at her peak fitness in lead. And so far you can call this a clutch performance, but at the end she won lead, big deal for Janja. So again, I think for the future it would be helpful to have a clearer definition, and if I hear clutch performance as somebody who does exceptionally well under pressure, better than you were expecting.
Yeah,
Not
that
just
makes sense. I think
fulfilling.
expectations, like maybe not like meeting what's expected, but in a way that almost ends up being like it's. I guess it's almost expected right now because if you look statistically, and we can talk about this in terms of like youth world championships, but just like in general, I'm curious to look at like the data of World Cups too. The amount of people who win all the rounds is very small,
Yeah,
statistically speaking. That win qualifiers, win semifinals, and then go on to win finals. It's
yeah,
very, very
yeah,
small. And
yeah.
the only person that I can think of that consistently does that is Yanya.
Yeah,
And
yeah. But I would again, like, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. In my book, Janja is the best competition climber, male or female. I would almost argue that she would have won the men's too. I mean, not for speed, but I think for the next Olympic Games, she can win any men's event in lead and bouldering. And I'm totally aware that many people don't believe me, but if you look, for example, at the Olympic, again, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate, but only a tiny bit. Like, can you imagine Janja not being able to do the last move that only Nathaniel did in the second boulder in the men's finals? Can you imagine that Janja would really struggle with this move?
yeah, those are like the what if scenarios. Like at some point, somebody's got to we got to have that comp, you know?
Yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure. So again, like Janja, and this is why I think she's. We were talking about playing the game or so, but she is like she. I would almost argue she's the only one who really fulfills her potential. What she's capable of in many competitions, and basically the only one. And everybody else, including all the boys, cannot do this.
So something that I want to talk about.
Sorry, Al, I can't hear you.
So something that I want to talk about from your post, and I think this is what a lot of people are going to be wondering about, is how do you not choke? And you talked about it by saying maybe, it's internal versus external focus
Yeah.
and what you're paying attention to. And I think maybe if you could go deeper and clarify what you mean by that. So
Yeah.
maybe
Uh,
provide some
uh,
examples.
Again, first of all, like after I posted this monkey study and I referred back to because I had been just watching male youth A bouldering finals, where, as you said, like the first three didn't make podium, and the second three, like fourth, fifth, and sixth place in the semis, made podium. So it was a reverse order, and that happened pretty often at this Youth World Champions. So I thought, all these things on social media, they're very simplified versions, of what's actually going on, and I think some people found it interesting, but it was also mentioned that like this is not choking, because this is just not an optimum performance, but it's not choking. To that, since we call this the Climbing Talent Development Show, like from my experience, I know many young climbers who never in their entire career put up came even close to 100% performance, where they really put everything in the competition setting, everything on the wall that they're capable of. And this is why I think it's really worthwhile discussing this, because I think part of it is that this never really addressed. That somehow that because there are always reasons. I'm not saying this. There's always a reason why you don't perform at your best. But if you think like of a long-term career, it's really, really important to address this, and think about it. And the reasons can be, there can be many reasons. For example, that the athletes are just never really practicing under these hot conditions. There's this distinction. If it's hot training, then you're emotionally really engaged. You have the same emotional arousal that you have under the competition setting. This is very often the case. But then when I listen to Stasha, and this is a little segue, I remembered that in skill acquisition, one of the biggest factors, if you want to acquire any new skill, is that you have an external focus of attention. If you want to play some Stasha videos, and I explain a little bit. This is her at the and again, like talking about clutch performance. This is her getting the bronze medal in Innsbruck in 2018, and this can be considered a clutch performance. In terms of that. She has been climbing fantastically. But the more important it is, the better she tends to perform. I hope that's not commentator's curse now. I hope that that we don't keep her from performing really well at the next World Championships. But not many people expected her to end up on the podium in Innsbruck. With this strong other starters. So there's definitely a clutch performance here. And the same, want to show the other video? So this is when she became European champion. And that was one of the few times where they had a super final. And the competitor she had to face in the super final is this girl, that we talked about. And so I think you can call this a clutch performance again. And the earliest footage, like the first time I was really aware of her climbing, was the other clip. This is all the way back in 2015, where she became European youth champion. And for that, what's interesting about that is that she is from Serbia. So that's basically, I think in 2015, she was probably the only young Serbian climber. So basically she went to La Jontière, won the European Championships. She went with her dad. And I think she had zero resources to draw from, So again, and I watched her throughout all this competition, and there was always this element of clutch performance in her climbing. Like she was always doing better than what you would have thought.
I want to kind of go through even a little bit more through like defining kind of what a clutch performance, because I kind of just even thinking in my experiences with athletes, a clutch performer for me is basically when the stakes are higher and higher, and this goes back to that study, like they shine. It's almost like you can't really show your best self until the stakes are higher and higher.
Yeah, yeah,
And and it's a quality I think that's like very independent of sport. It's like it doesn't matter, and this is something that I see of a lot of people, and I like to think of myself as somebody who really enjoys if I'm excited by the opportunity to perform when there's a lot of pressure, you know, and it's something that you see no matter how big or small the task is. It's like almost like a gambling type thing where it's like,
yeah,
oh, I'm gonna make this, I'm gonna throw this in the trash from here. Like, watch me. Like, you know, you put yourself on the spot and you like want to seek out those things. And to me, that's kind of like a quality of an athlete that it, you you want to try to like learn. And then in the opposite, if you're choking, it's kind of like the higher the pressure gets, the bigger the spotlight, it really impacts your performance negatively. Um,
yeah,
and there's going to be a
yeah.
spectrum of that, but you know, ah,
I switched it off.
it's
Okay.
but like for Sasha, it sounds like she's one of those athletes where the bigger the spotlight, the better, like you can
Yeah.
perform.
Yeah,
Um,
the thing is, though, as you said, across all sports, but I don't have it in my mind. But you still see, if you compare to soccer, football, we just had the championships, and the question would be if Lionel Messi ever failed a penalty shot. That would be interesting. Because I think like. From my active time when I was competing, same thing. I was never really impressive in training, but I never really choked when it was really important. So good, but I wouldn't count on it, So that's the thing, And I think nobody in the world can really call him or herself a clutch performer. I think that's already the end of your series of clutch performances. If you pride yourself of being capable, I mean, it's good. I still think there's a lot of confidence you gain from this. That to have something extra to give. And that you in your past you had been capable of doing this, but again, it's still
or I guess for me, what I somebody who can perform in clutch situations frequently, I think one of the characteristics of an athlete like that is that seek those experiences out, like are excited by it. And I think that's a really good example of what you're saying because, in soccer, you have people on the team that will say, I do not want to take penalties. Like
yeah,
they will hide and say, well, I don't want to
yeah,
take them because it's just like the pressure of the situation. It's kind of
yeah,
for me playing, I was one of those players at that point in time where I was like, I don't really want to take them because, if you miss, it's embarrassing. Like,
yeah,
you're expected to score. It's big.
yeah,
It could be like win or lose for your team. And then there's the players that are like, oh yeah, I'll take. Like, I want to take them.
yeah.
And
But then the question is, do these people ever fail? And what happens then?
I think that's the
Because
important part. They do, but
yeah,
they just realize that that's it's not. That's.
Sure. That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there have been
I
some
think,
pretty famous misses by some
yeah.
really big players. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the last championship was even that I think the English coach, the British coach, kind of played on this. Like he put new players in just for the penalty kicks. And on a very short notice. So they were on the field just a couple of minutes before they had to perform the penalty kicks. And this didn't go, this didn't work out. That was too much of a gamble. So, but I think one thing that also needs a little bit more definition, I just put it a little bit out there, the whole thing with the external focus of attention. I think we should, I think I should define a little bit more what that is. So if you do a climbing move, and you look for the red hold and try to reach this would be an external focus of attention. If you think about like bending your leg or extending your hip or something like this would be an internal focus of attention. So that sounds really trivial unless you start to think about, because I think the root starts really early. It starts really early to maybe go wrong. Like, for example, you do your strength and conditioning under bodybuilding perspective. So especially with young boys, I mean, this is a very important aspect for them to build a attractive looking body, athletic body. And so they think of that training very often in terms of, okay, this builds biceps. And so you're already flirting with internal focus of attention. Then there is the totally opposite side of the spectrum. It's like in terms of strength and conditioning, is the whole yoga and somatic world. Where, for example, you picture your pelvis as being filled with water, and if you tilt it, you spill the water in front of you, and stuff like this. That can be super valuable. But there is so much science about it, so many studies about it, that leads to choking. And you have like this. So what I want to say is that maybe many coaches are not really aware of that in their daily practice. Some of they prime their athletes towards eternal focus of attention without even being really aware of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I think it's like, what do you, what is it about that leads to choking, I guess, would be my question.
It's if you're overly like, if your cognition is really focused on the task, like I think that's what they even think the monkeys do, they start thinking about the task, and this alone is it's the downfall. You should be, and I think for climbing it's almost in a way like in my mind, it's even easier to understand, because if you're not perceptive towards your environment. So, and this is also, I think, the problem with many, I like for the youth worlds, do some of those kids, if I may call them like this, do they already have like mental coaches or like advice from this side?
I mean, I think it's basically in the way that coaches are mental coaches, like almost like a not specialized. Some of them might, and that's kind of the challenging thing about making any sort of, because they're all coming from different programs, so it's hard to know what each program is doing.
Yeah, why I'm mentioning this is because in the world, I think of people that call themselves mental coaches, a lot comes from close skill activities like figure skating, gymnastics, like diving, all these activities, where the environment doesn't change a whole lot, where even if you perform in Tokyo and you have the same diving board as in Los Angeles, so some techniques work really well, but I think these techniques, as at least to my knowledge and my experience, don't work very well in for activities where you have to be perceptive, where you have to find affordances and identify affordances, and yeah.
So would you qualify internal focus as like self-consciousness? Would that be fair?
That's an aspect. That's definitely an aspect of it. Like if you even I mean, obviously everybody is different, but like very often, for example, you're really aware of your heart rate. So is this the bad thing? No, not at all. But in the performance context, it is, because you have more important things on your plate than focusing on your heart rate. In general, it's a good thing to be able to be aware of your heartbeat, and maybe even being aware of lowering this, but not if you have to solve a tricky boulder problem. So yeah, it's self-conscious is really what it says, internal focus of attention. But again, that starts really early, like even how as a coach, how you cue, for example, there's like this thing, triple extension, like for this jump, like youth B, female youth B had something like this. I think the last boulder, where you would, as a coach, would have been almost tempted to say, look, extend your hip, and extend, do triple extension, extend everything, and don't leave any potential length of your body on the plate. But this would be an internal cue, that would direct the focus of attention internally. Whereas much more powerful to kind of maybe cue, like what is really surprisingly powerful if you imagine your gaze as a suction, like as the chameleon's tongue or octopus's arm, like there's even like for the viewers that want to learn more about this, because it's really wild field. So we don't do it justice with just this few minutes talking about it. But there's a recent book, The Extended Mind, and it's about thinking outside your brain. This is basically the subtitle of this book, and it's a really fascinating field. Even if you think about activities like tennis, like fantastic tennis players, the bat is an extension of their body. And I think the same is really powerful in climbing. If you see the climbing wall and the affordances of a hole as an extension of your body. And for example, this perspective, of course, this has to be practiced lots. I think it's really powerful for climbers too. That also would avoid that they miss affordances. So that's definitely an important part of it, but it also would make choking much less likely. And again, to close my train of thought, when I was listening to Stasha commenting the recent Grand Lead World Cup, I thought, whoa, she's so perceptive. I wonder what this has to do with her record of pulling up some clutch performances. And I clearly see a connection there.
One of the, kind of to circle back to something you said, of how important it is for coaches to cue, and I saw this recently at practices. I think there's like an aspect, like you said, the triple extension thing, which is like almost the physical aspect of like breaking down movement for athletes. And basically kind of what you're saying too, even with tennis, it is an extension of the jacket, or sorry, it's an extension, the racket is an extension of your arm in a way. And I think most athletes would know when they're in that like flow state, for a lack of a better term, you're not, like, you can't be thinking about, oh, technically I want to make sure that I twist.
No.
Like if you get to that point, it's become too because that breaks your timing. You can't interject with that cognition because it breaks up your timing. And I think that's a really important part of what you're talking about. You know, if you're in the middle of a coordination move, that requires a lot of things to be right at the same time. Well, I gotta jump, triple extend, like hit this hold at the right velocity. If you're thinking about it and how you need to do it at that point in time, it's probably breaking up your timing, and that's something that you notice. And you can see it in climbers when they're doing it. It almost looks a little too robotic, you know, versus
Yeah.
somebody who's like, and an example of cueing this kind of what you're talking about is the difference of being like, hey, I want you to really like extend ankle, knee, and hip, kind of what you're saying, to stand up over this hold, versus something like, hey, you're aiming for this. I want you to aim for this part of the wall way over here, which gets you the same result from a cueing standpoint, but it's like you said, now you're focusing on almost you're just giving them a point to reach for that makes the other stuff happen as a secondary, but basically it's getting triple extension without like making them focus on like because the way people think once they go on and they're like, okay, I gotta extend the ankle, and so both of those, there's like an element almost of periodization in your training that you're talking about too, because as you're starting with somebody at the beginning of the season, you can probably be a little bit more internal focused and like technical coaching. If somebody's having a hard time picking up on what you're saying, and you're like, maybe in this point, it's okay, but then probably as you transition to like a more competitive part of the season, that might not be the best idea.
Yeah, actually, the way it's mostly regarded is like the more of a beginner somebody is, the more he or she benefits from external focus of attention. And then it's almost a little bit like the opposite, like the really advanced climber athlete, you can give some internal, maybe you can talk about the hip being filled with water, at a certain point. But again, you're right. In terms of periodization, keep this away from actually performing. That's also very related to what we talked before, like the practice and performance. The difference to be aware if you're practicing or if you're performing in a session. I just, if I may, I just started a climbing performance coaching series that I'm selling, and I just finished the first part, becoming an effective climbing coach, and it's really, it's like more than 100 minutes. It's really thick, like only watch it if you're really committed, but it's exactly about stuff like this, all the things you ideally want to consider. Like if you're serious about our job, there's a lot of things, like even if that really can bite you in a couple of years, like where you like again you always cued movements like internally, and like you were always talking like as a bodybuilder, like in terms of muscle action, first you contract the biceps, then you do this, like give your athletes like step-by-step instructions of movements, and like what the science is thinking now and what all studies hint to, this will be a huge problem at one point in the athlete's career. Now, and this is why I think it's so important that we look at something like the youth world and say, okay, what is actually like on this performance level, what is actually happening, and also be, even if it hurts, be honest about it.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that's it, and that's part of also just becoming better coaches too. Uh, I had this moment for myself where the way I think of coaching a lot of times, especially for an event like something like that, where you're working with a lot of different athletes, it's like you're also playing a game in a way where you have opportunities where you can say some things, and they have some impact, sometimes a lot less than we think, sometimes maybe more than we know. But it's like that's an opportunity for you to make a play essentially. And sometimes you make the wrong play and you have to reflect on it very similar to the athletes and be like, okay,
Yeah,
well, you know, and I had a lot of those moments. I think one of the things that I liked most about events like that was my first experience coaching in an, an IFSC setting. And I can very during the 10 days, it was like simultaneously go from feeling like I'm really good at my job to feeling like I'm really, really, really bad at my job.
yeah,
But I really enjoy that because that like that's usually a good sign for me that like I'm in a good place of growth, where
yeah,
I can
yeah.
simultaneously feel, from day to day, feel like,
Yeah, but still, it's tough. It's really tough. Like especially with teenagers, as you said, you don't even know if you reach them at all. Like or even in the slightest positive way. If you because. I mean, you can feel so miserable as a coach. It's really painful. And the only thing I've somehow found peace with the situation is that I at least try something and give it a shot, and so that I don't have to blame myself to not try something, and then I just try to keep track of what happens, comes out of this. So if for example, I see an issue and it's not working very well, or the athlete is not clearly not being competent in this situation, and I interfere in one way or the other, and the same thing happens again. I would then that wasn't a good action from my side. No, but if it changes, even if it changes not to something better, I think it was worthwhile. So the only thing I'm looking for is actually change, and for me that gives me a lot of peace of mind. You know,
yeah, and I think,
even if it's like, okay, now you really destroyed her confidence, for the time being, and so you can basically this event is won't be successful. But that doesn't mean that next weekend, things are different and you benefit from this, what you thought was a mistake a week ago. Well, I had this happening where yeah.
yeah, and I think that's like a sign of the same thing. Like you're treating coaching as like those are the experiments that we're asking the athletes to make as well. So basically what you're saying is the same thing for me is, and you have to kind of treat it the same way where it's like, well, you could really wallow and feel really bad about what you did for a long period of time. And I think that's like, but that's also not productive for, especially if you have to coach the next day. Uh, I think the real miss, and this is goes for athletes as well, is if you make a mistake and you're not reflecting and learning from it, that's when it really becomes a mistake. And I guess that's kind of cliche, but yeah, it's not really a mistake until you don't like learn anything from it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And again, you have to be honest. Again, I find it sometimes hard to really identify a mistake or failure. The only thing that really sets off an alarm is if a pattern emerges that is not working really well, like a dysfunctional thing, and I can't break it. But so it's almost like, okay, we've been in exactly the situation and unfolded exactly in the same negative way as it does now. So this would be like, okay, what we did in the meantime wasn't very productive, or wasn't helping. I'm more looking for these patterns. If and again, going back to not identifying this, if we talk about choking, and so I think that can easily happen over 10 years or more, where you have an athlete and you see this issue and it's not addressed and not in many cases not even discussed, because I mean, who likes to discuss these unpleasant things, and then it happens again, And every time you're not addressing this, it almost gets worse. And it makes it harder. It's like in a relationship where you had a little lie at the beginning, and every time you repeat it, it manifests itself even more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really highlights the importance whenever we talk about stuff like this, is that especially for any sort of coaching that is like from the mental side of things, um, it can feel like I think for a lot of athletes, it has the stigma of almost being like a quality, like a personality uh, trait that's like, choking like it's a condition or something
Yeah,
like that. Um, Anything like that, performance anxiety, like, a lot of these things, if just socially, they're gonna feel like, well, my fingers aren't strong enough. Okay, that's something that I am missing athletically. But like, if I have suffer from performance anxiety, that's just a condition that's on me that like if we talk about it, you're almost like attacking me as a person type thing.
yeah, yeah,
There's like that personal attachment that isn't really there for the other side of stuff. And I think developing a relationship with the athletes where they start to understand that that's not how that is, that that's just as like basically it's like if I say you're lacking finger strength, or I say you have performance anxiety, those are two parts of like a complete athlete, and it's the same thing, or this here's what we're going to do to work on this stuff, and here's what we're going to do to work on this stuff. But it's not like you're not broken, you know.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
that's just something you need to work on.
Yeah, yeah, and I would almost like, depending on how old the athletes are, I would almost be a little bit shy away from calling it even performance anxiety, because if you put it in the box, then it manifests itself even more. No, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, like, I know many, or actually, I know one woman who is an opera singer, and she sings in front of thousands of people. But she's afraid of anything else in her life. It's not a thing of, you name it, spiders, anything, but she sings, as she's not joking, so I think, to a point, that's true for everybody. We all have situations where we're really competent, even under pressure. And this is really important to keep in mind. I'm not just saying this. I know world-class whitewater paddlers, who drop down 30 meters on waterfalls, but if they had to sing in front of even their friends, they would choke. And I think so, especially if you're dealing with young folk. And that's why I'm asking also with the mental coaches, because that then it gets a thing. And I think that's very important to identify what are the factors and what is it in this situation that was concerning, or took your attention away, or no.
Yeah, and I think that needs to be like what you're saying, even just how you choose to address it in terms of like what you're taught. You have to develop basically a relationship of where communicating about it isn't like it's not a indictment on them as like a person, that they don't
Yeah,
feel like that they understand that this is just part of, being an athlete, and that everybody's going through it. Um, that some people just are, some people are predisposed to be better on certain things, and
yeah,
and so like you said, it's just if you're able to have that conversation with somebody, and I'm saying, it, because otherwise you can't even have the conversation to begin with,
yeah,
if you haven't developed that relationship. So that's kind of like the other side of it, so that you can start having that conversation with the athlete and being like, hey, what was going on while you were doing this, while you had that experience, and they don't just shut down. Basically,
yeah,
you're like, you brought up like something that they feel personally almost like,
yeah.
attacked over.
Yeah, I only yeah, absolutely. And again, I think as a coach, this process ideally starts as early as possible. Of course, not in a like formal way that you use like a whole lot of psychological terminology and blah 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 blah. No, don't make it bigger than, but put the kids under some pressure basically in every training, to get them familiar, and then talk about what happens, and how to maybe perform a little better, even if they're really, really young. I think that's because this creates this trust and their awareness of how important this is, to perform well under these circumstances. This is really important that it starts early.
Cool. All right. Well, I think it's a good place to wrap up. I do want you to give us some shameless self-promotion. Where can they find the new?
It's on my site. I mean, you find it on Vimeo, and if you've never been to my website, it's Udini, UDINI.com, and it's under education. Previously I did some other. No, it's just Udini. This is just my email, and but I used to call my production Udini.com. Exactly, that's my my site. And again, I just finished this really long, basically introduction video, becoming an effective climbing coach. But for the future, I will have one thing about the climbing coach's eye, about video analysis, like really hands-on, like working with even apps like the coach's eye and so on. And then I want to do something about skill acquisition. And maybe in November I have this out. That should be really interesting. And then the last one is really fascinating, is neurocognitive efficiency, it will be called. And this is basically that. Yes. I mean, if you have a better suggestion that doesn't sound so... You call this highbrow, if it's a mouthful?
No, it sounds nice. Yeah.
No, it's actually it somehow like the way I see it, it almost picks up to what we talked about today. To really be aware. I did this little silly post where I put like information on different exercises. So the information you have to pick up, and there was one thing where Ross speed climbs on a tree, as an example where you need a lot of information to perform well. Or I remember when we did the Mesorim, we had this partner climbing, and the kids were experimenting with not just holding their hands, but also toe hooking each other. And this would be examples with really huge amount of information needed to perform well, and the post was, the little silly post was about that, encourage people to ask themselves, okay, how much information does this exercise or does my training hold? Because again, going back to what we said before, if you're always practicing with really reduced information, and then suddenly you are in this overwhelming setting, that can't go well. That is not a good preparation. And this is what this neurocognitive efficiency video will be about. Yeah,
I'm excited.
A lot of editing.
Yeah. And if you want to email me, that's I have a new email.
Cool. Okay.
Hi. You can send me an email, Udo. Any questions?
Yes. Okay. Cool. Okay. Again, talking of questions, leave them below. I think today we talked about a lot of things.
We'll get back on a schedule and try to,
Yes.
be a little bit concise to that conversation. When we don't have to do it, and maybe I'll get a haircut, shave again, try to look more professional.
And maybe sleep when it's dark in San Diego.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, thank you all, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks, Udo.
Thank you, Al.